First of all, welcome to Ireland. Welcome to Dublin. This stadium is, I guess it's a sacred place in Ireland. It's a mixture of Fenway Park, Yankee Stadium, Wembley, the new camp. I don't know what the Padres Stadium in San Diego is, but okay, the Metro, yeah. So it's a famous and sacred place, and I've had a look at your itinerary, and I'm also very jealous. I think you're going to go into the Guinness store, you're going to Kilkenny. If any of you can escape for the weekend, go to Cork. That's where I'm from. That's kind of real deep Ireland. But anyway, you're very welcome. And in order to try and explain what's going on in the world, having looked at your itinerary, I put together a presentation that starts in Ireland. It sort of tells a bit of a personal story. So, many of you will know Irish history. It is now a very wealthy country, a country with a very strong economy. It wasn't always the case. And around about the 1990s, Irish society, politics, and particularly the economy became transformed when communism fell, when globalization started around the world. I became fascinated by it, and I wrote a book called Ireland and the Global Question. And that's been in a slightly kind of geeky way, it's been a sort of a hobby of mine for the last 30 years. And the last book I wrote was about the end of globalization. So in a way, we're kind of, in the 1990s, globalization started, and now we're at the end of it. In some cases, we're at kind of the dismantling of globalization. But the point I want to leave you with today is that many countries and many leaders are searching for what's next. It's like a construction site, which I hope is a good analogy. We're kind of demolishing some of the old things, but also beginning to build some of the new institutions, some of the new economies and technologies. And first of all, just to show you what a dramatic effect globalization had on Ireland. This is a long-run chart, to say the least. It goes back to about 1820, and it's Irish GDP relative to that of Britain. And if you took it back even further, the picture would be pretty much the same. And it shows you that, for such a long time, for reasons we know very well, Ireland was a very poor, economically underdeveloped country. But then suddenly, in 1990, with the lift-off of globalization, it became transformed. And part of that was the spread of US multinationals. In the 90s, there was a famous economist called them the B-52s of globalization. They kind of spread out around the world. They spread effectively the American knowledge base, the American way of doing things, and also they joined up the world. They joined up the emerging Asian countries, they joined up Eastern Europe, and also Europe and the States. And we've had this very prosperous, very peaceful period of globalization that's characterized by kind of tight integration and interdependence of countries. And that's now come to an end. Okay, this is how it feels today. You can't have a world that's integrated and interdependent if the two biggest economies, China and America, are barely talking to each other. And I guess in many of your jobs, you are witnessing the physical shift of supply chains from some emerging countries back home or back to more friendly countries. We are feeling firsthand the effect of tariffs. We're feeling firsthand the fact that commerce is becoming more geostrategic or geopolitical. And I think one of the lessons I'm always keen to make is that the period of globalization we've seen has brought massive prosperity. When we talk about it, we tend to focus very much on the States and China and Europe. But if you look at the other big populous economies of the world, Indonesia, for example, wealth per adult in the last 20 years has gone up by 8 times. So it's had a really strong and broad positive effect across the world. Some countries arguably haven't used the benefits of globalization as well as others, and that's, I think, why you're getting political unrest or political change. But one of the lessons we can learn is that there was a period of globalization before, from 1870 to about 1910. And if you look at all the economic numbers, the size of stock markets, the amplitude of trade, it was as dramatic as we've seen in the last 30 years. We've just forgotten about it. And even back then, they had electric scooters, they had electric vehicles, they had huge stock market bubbles. So today, the AI companies are about, I think, 40% of the US stock market. Well, in 1900, railway stocks were 60% of the stock market. So the idea is that you have these new technologies that become the infrastructure of the future, and people throw capital at them. Some of those companies survive, others don't. And I guess the lesson from this period of history, it was a period of innovation. This is a note from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. And he wrote this in 1918. And I love it because you can picture him sort of sitting in bed with his iPad, right? Ordering stuff on Amazon or trading commodities. And he was a famous and notorious commodity trader, by the way. He bankrupted himself twice. And it gives us a sense of kind of the echo and the similarity of that period with what we are experiencing today. And on a more cautionary note, that period ended badly. It ended in economic strife, in war, and in financial collapse. And I'm not forecasting any of that is going to happen, but what I'm urging is that we remember the lessons of the past and try and steer ourselves onto a straight course. And I guess to understand, what we're losing, in the 90s when globalization was really taking off, America was at the center of globalization. And the model of globalization was that, America would provide the know-how and the capital. China was at the time a poor country and provided the manufacturing base. And America was central in so many different ways to the Northern Ireland peace process, the peace process in Yugoslavia, almost had a peace deal in the Middle East. In financial crisis, we had Brady bonds brought an end to the Latin American crisis. We had Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, known as the Committee to Save the World, who brought an end to the LTCM, the Russian and the Asian financial crisis. And I'm raising this because today there's really no committee to save the world. Everyone is kind of doing their own thing, okay, which is troubling. So for me, what really struck me of COVID, which I thought was a sort of a miracle of humanity, was the fact that the big regions didn't really come together and say, well, let's make vaccines together, let's make masks together. They squabbled over these scarce resources. So the point I'm getting at is that the world of globalization, of integration, of collaboration and cooperation is behind us, and we're into a slightly more selfish world where even neighbors are beginning to squabble. Mark Carney was in the White House this week. He struck quite a tough note on the relationship between Canada and the US. So it's I think a more of a testing world, more of a selfish world, and I think that ethic, if you like, will be with us maybe for the next 5 or 10 years until we build new relationships and new institutions. Now, what are we going into? This is a slightly obscure looking, we're not going back to the 17th century, I hope. But what I would describe as being next after globalization is, it's a fancy word called the interregnum. And one of my kind of quirks is I'm fascinated by 17th century British history. So in 1648, it was a crucial time in world history. You had the end of the 30-Year War, the effective formation of the idea of the nation state, which is still with us today. And in that period, Britain was kind of a bit left out, but Britain had its own things going on. King Charles the First was captured. He was imprisoned and he was later executed. And in his absence, for the first time ever in a European country, the people had a chance to kind of debate what their democracy would look like. And that's where I got this phrase, the agreement of the people, or l'accord du peuple, as we say in France. So it was a fascinating time that you had these people who said, right, you know, there's no king, we will try and form our own democracy. And it was a very idealistic period, and you know, the people were kind of countermanded by Cromwell, and it didn't end well. Cromwell was deposed, and then Charles II came back. He was restored to the throne. But that period of experimentation was called the interregnum. And I think that's what we're into today, is a sort of a 15-year period where there'll be lots of experimentation. I think this Trump government is the first attempt to really kind of experiment and remake America and remake the world order. There'll be other iterations to follow. And you know, if you don't like 17th century history, a contemporary example that's close to my heart, was actually two of them, is football. So Manchester United are one of the biggest football clubs in the world. Sir Alex Ferguson, who's a former manager, took the reins at Manchester United around the time globalization started, actually. And he was massively successful over 30 or so years. And then he retired. And that club, like you know, many American football clubs, many other European soccer clubs, my own county Cork in terms of hurling, if you look at the award boards outside, have spent a long time trying to recapture that glory. And Manchester United in particular are going through all these managers. I think they're on their 6th manager in maybe 13 years or something. So that's kind of what's ahead of us. It's a period of trying different things to try and get back to this period of prosperity and stability. And I call it the interregnum. Another way of showing you, I think, what's at stake, that's, I think, relevant to your industry. And when I was preparing for this, I went through various reports by the OECD on supply chains. And I found this chart, and the meaning of the chart is not so much important. What the OECD are doing is they're looking at the impact on supply chains of tariffs per country. And the chart's a bit fuzzy. But what I'm really trying to show you is that we're going from a period of, flat calm and stability to a period that looks a bit like kind of Brownian motion. It's much more volatile and much more uncertain. And when I speak to industrial companies, financial companies, the idea that uncertainty is much, much higher, and that uncertainty is coming from new and different sources, is something that really begins to ring true. So where are we going? There is so much apparent chaos in the world today, and you wake up and things happen, you thought, even though I spend my time thinking about this, I couldn't have forecast that. If I try and dig beneath the noise and sort of the chaos as to where we're going, I think we're going towards what I would call a multipolar world. And a multipolar world is made up of maybe two things. So one is big kind of economic or geopolitical blocs. But the key thing is, and this is a key thing for people who are in the supply chain industrial world, is that those blocs will increasingly do things differently. Okay? So under globalization, certainly in Ireland, we've adopted a kind of more of an American way of doing things, and I think our culture probably suits that. We're also a European country, so we're kind of on the cusp of these two cultures which have coexisted and now going slightly different ways. So for many Irish companies or policymakers, this is becoming something they're trying to grapple with. And the narrative at the moment is that America innovates, China copies, and Europe regulates. And I don't think that is fair. In Europe, there's lots of innovation. It's not scaled and maybe not financed correctly. And I think neither is it fair on China. I mean, China is a massive innovator. And what happens is when it does innovate, it gets the state behind those innovations in a very, very forceful way. So, but that's sort of the narrative. But if you look at things like the internet or AI, so if I go back to 2008, Google had 30-something% market share in China. 2 years later, it was 0. Okay, so before we all had the same kind of internet, now China has ring-fenced its internet, but it's still a massive e-commerce sector. In the US, the internet or social media is just a massive stock market phenomenon, which we don't have in Europe, where we do actually tend to regulate. So each of these big blocs is doing things in a very, very different way. And if I was to talk about AI, in Europe we have the EU AI Act, and it's not regulated in the States, and it's controlled. It's not regulated in China, it's controlled in China. They are doing things in different ways. So my point is, if you are a multinational company and you're facing into Asia, you're facing into Europe, you're facing back into the States, it's like having to speak 3 different languages, whereas previously you had one standard. So that adds to complexity, it adds potentially to friction. Then there's other parts of the world that I'm actually very, very optimistic about. In a multipolar world where you've got these 3 big kind of poles, I think there's room for a 4th one. And hopefully this morning we're getting, I think, encouraging signs of a peace deal in the Middle East. And experts in the Middle East will tell you, well, there are 2 Middle East. There's the geopolitical Middle East and there's the economic Middle East. And the economic Middle East is really beginning to come on. You have this big bloc that kind of joins up India, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and many of the countries around, stretching up to the southern shores of Europe. And it's a catchment area of 2 billion people. And they're very agnostic about trade. They have these trade formulas. So they'll do a trade deal with Russia on a Tuesday and one with Ukraine on a Thursday. So it's very much a region that's kind of open for business. And it's a region that's beginning to maybe not turn in on itself, but really focus on its own development. And anyone who does business in the Middle East now should notice a change of attitude in that instead of them being regarded as kind of a pool of capital, they really will stress that Western companies have to come and base themselves there. And a couple of even supply chain companies I know have been asked to locate manufacturing distribution in the Middle East. So what I call the 4th pole, the region from India to Saudi Arabia, with kind of Abu Dhabi as its Washington, if you like, is a region I'm very, very optimistic on for the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Geopolitics is back in many ways. These are 2 of the kind of cutting-edge military technology firms, Anduril, Helsing in Europe, both deep tech, both driven by AI. And geopolitics is now something for all of us. It used to be something for admirals and generals and diplomats. But if you look in the last 3 or 4 weeks alone at the logistical disruptions in Europe, from drones, from fighter jet incursions, from hacking. I met a lady in Cork yesterday. She's half Danish, half Irish. And she was telling me that she is stockpiling tins of food at home, and she has a stockpile of cash because the Danish government is telling people to stockpile some cash in case payment systems, for example, are hacked and can't function. We don't have that state of alarm in Ireland, but that is the new reality. And as that example shows, it is beginning to encroach into the behavior of ordinary people and ordinary consumers. And also, I think we're on the cusp of a new economic model. I think, and a model where companies actually become closer to governments because those companies are strategic. You have that already in China. You have that in some European countries like France. The corporate sector is actually quite close, or the strategic corporate sector is actually quite close to the state. And I think as we go through the build out of AI, big technology firms will actually become closer to the state, not grow further apart. If you look at data centers, for example, we're expected to build about $4 trillion of data centers in the States, and they will be paid for by private credit industry and by the balance sheets of the big tech companies. But AI infrastructure is strategic. It's something that the government wants to keep its hands on. So I think in the future you'll have more of a, you have the idea of kind of national champions becoming more the norm maybe in Europe and certainly in the States. And we've seen even in the steel sector, some of the big mergers have become very, very big strategic and geopolitical issues. So just to end this section on geopolitics before I start to talk about economics, and I'm happy to take any questions as we go along. What does it mean for your businesses? Well, I think there's a bunch of things. The first is that we're going into a world where, we've kind of done things one way, the Anglo-Saxon way, the American way. Now we're going into a multipolar world where big blocs will do things in quite different ways. AI regulation is a good example, and as business people, we'll have to be sensitized to that and interrogate that. Supply chains and infrastructure can be disrupted by geopolitics. So when Russian jets flew across Polish airspace, the Poles closed off a rail route that took Chinese goods up to Belarus. And it did so because they know there's a close link between the Chinese and the Russians. So they're using this supply chain to punish one of Russia's partners, and they've since reopened that. New supply chains are being mapped. I've done some work recently for a Michigan firm called Optologic. And they're interesting because they map supply chains. And electronically it's very interesting because it's highly complex. But if you look at the different ways in which they're trying to map supply chains and the different constraints they have, it is literally like the map of the world beginning to change. And also supply chains are becoming much more strategic. And the issue of security is being embedded into supply chains. So there's a fast-growing American firm called Altana who kind of digitize the imprint of supply chains so they know everything that's happening right down through those supply chains. There's a slightly more secretive firm called Datana, which if you're dealing with someone in China, they will be able to tell you whether that person has got links to the Chinese military or the government. So highly, so the sort of spyfare is coming into our world. And then there's kind of security of supply. So if you look at some of the big car companies, BMW have located to Canada to try and get access to batteries. Stellantis sourcing energy in the US. Toyota, massive manufacturer, is stockpiling chips because we are in the midst of what people call chip wars. So supply chains are becoming very, very much globalized, infused with the idea of geopolitics and security, and bringing supply chains back into kind of friendly domains. So let's jump to economics, because I think economics and some of the challenges of economics are behind this. Whenever I mention debt to Irish people, they almost have a heart attack, because 15 years ago we had our own very brutal debt crisis. And Ireland, I think, has done a great job of repairing itself. And we're now a country that has a relatively low debt load, both for households and for governments. But one of the big drags and one of the big leftovers of the era of globalization, economists call it imbalances, is the fact that the world has never been as indebted. So if you take China, Japan, the US, France, Italy, the UK, they add up to about 60% of world GDP, okay? And they all have debt to GDP ratios on average about 110%. And the textbooks, 20 years ago would have said, well, if you get above 60, you're in real trouble. And then they said, there was Ken Rogoff had a book a couple of years ago, said if you get beyond 90%, the economy will collapse. And they keep going. And this accumulation of debt will probably be the most impactful economic force in the next 5 to 10 years for a couple of reasons. One is that all these big countries are indebted at the same time, so they will likely be trying to get out of debt at the same time, and they will do so in very, very different ways. In the UK, they're trying to do the kind of the textbook, so they're cutting back spending. They are talking about raising taxes. They've raised taxes on the wealthier, taken away tax breaks, and 91 billion pounds of wealthy people have left the UK for Dubai and Milan. So the UK shows that kind of conventional or orthodox policy doesn't really work that well in this context. In France, we are now through, I live in Paris, and I've lost count of how many prime ministers we've had, and I think it's 5, tomorrow it could be 6, in the last year. And the impression you get is that, first of all, no politician in France wants to tackle the deficit or debt. They want to leave that for the next generation, which is disappointing. But also the impression you get is that politics is being eaten by debt. And by the fiscal outlook. So it's going to have a big impact on politics, on society, on geopolitics. The historian Niall Ferguson has come up with a rule which is that there's no country that has spent more on the interest payments on its debt than on its military and state and empire. So he's gone back, to the 17th century and before. And America spends about 100 billion more on its interest payments than on its military, and it spends a lot on its military. So these are kind of, if you like, quite scary and existential times. Now, the only rider I will give you to this is that I made a documentary for the BBC about 2 years ago on this problem. We haven't had a debt collapse since then. And lots of people have been writing about this for the last 5, 6, 7 years, saying there's too much debt, it's a big problem. And the fact that markets have managed to digest all this debt tells me that there's a degree of stability in the world economy. And that stability is actually in the corporate sector and it's in the household sector. So by and large, across the world, households don't have a lot of debt, by and large. And by and large, across the world, corporates don't have a lot of debt. And that leads me to think that governments will become more burdened with debt, and debt will weigh on politics and it'll condition political choices. But a lot of the heavy lifting will be taken up by corporates. And I go back to my example of corporates fueling the AI spending in the US, so they are kind of doing what governments would normally do. In the UK, as an example, the Labour Party, before they came to government about a year ago, they wanted to spend £30 billion on energy infrastructure. And then they took a look at the numbers, and they said, oh, we don't have any money. So we have to downgrade that to 8 billion. And now they're back up to 30 billion, but the residue, whatever 22 billion, is being made up by Canadian pension funds and private equity companies. So the private sector, I think, will become much more of a driver of important infrastructure and key technologies in collaboration with governments in the future. And this leads me to the US and tariffs, and we can dig in a bit to tariffs. To some people, I think the economic policy in the US looks chaotic. And if you are a sort of a standard economist, someone from the IMF, you would probably wag your finger and say, well, they shouldn't be doing this. And I think what is interesting is that the policy of the White House is very unorthodox, right? So resurrecting policies that were applied maybe in the 20s, that are kind of antique policies that worked then because we didn't really have central banks then, we didn't have proper taxes, and bringing them back now. And if I try and unify what the White House is doing, I think he and they are very much motivated by debt and by the fiscal deficit. So the kind of things they're doing is, well, let's reduce the potential military spending bill. Let's get the Europeans to pay. And ironically, Germany had to change its debt laws and its debt brake. And I think tariffs are part of this because I think the White House doesn't want to raise taxes or cut spending. So they're going for kind of unconventional measures. And optically, those unconventional measures are beginning to work. So the White House is taking in about $30 billion in tariff revenues per month, which is more than people expected. What we haven't seen is the sort of secondary and tertiary impact of that. We're beginning to see the effect on inflation. So inflation, having got under control, is just beginning now to kind of get a bit sticky and to rise again. And we will be at a kind of a higher trend level of inflation in the States. And I think, despite all the pressures on the Fed will begin to react to this. And I think one of the reasons the president wants to kind of get his arms around the Federal Reserve, in my view, is not so much to change interest rates, but to get control of the Fed as kind of like a giant monetary hoover, so that if bond yields get out of control, he can do what the Bank of Japan has done in the last 10 years and get the Fed to buy bonds and keep sort of stability in the bond market, because the bond market is the only thing that he, it seems, is scared of. So I think there is an underlying rationale for all of this. So where does this leave tariffs at the moment? So tariffs on steel and overall tariffs are close to historical highs. And I think we're probably at the peak level of tariffs. We haven't had an aggressive European response. The EU released its response actually Tuesday evening, where it said it's going to put tariffs on steel of 50% above a certain volume. And it was a very European response. It looks angry, but if you go through it, it's very conditional, and it needs the approval of all of the European nations, including Germany, whose auto sector is under stress. So to my mind, I interpret that as kind of Europe saying, we're kind of ready for business, ready to negotiate. I think the two things that will probably reverse or stop tariffs, one is if inflation continues to rise and if the US economy weakens. Bringing back tariffs or lowering tariffs would actually be a reasonably sane and easy way of kind of having a sort of a stimulus, just taking some pressure out of the system. It would actually arithmetically lower inflation and take some of the stress out of the trading system. So, if we get some economic pressure, stagflation, it's probably not a bad thing in terms of the future outlook for tariffs. China is the other variable, I think, that matters. Because if there is some kind of accord with China on trade, and I think an accord will be found probably beginning of next year at a very kind of superficial level, that might also allow tariffs to be rolled back, particularly if there's sufficient lobbying, etc. The other way I think China will impact your industry in terms of demand for machinery, for steel, etc., is in terms of its economy. And there was a great headline about 2 years ago in the New York Times, and they said that China is the economy that has failed to fail, okay? Because China has so many imbalances. There's lots of private sector debt, there's lots of local authority debt. It's in the middle of a kind of reordering its manufacturing cycle, but it hasn't had an official recession, and it hasn't had any kind of major financial collapse. And to that end, it's both a mystery and a credit to policymakers there. But China, I spoke about debt. China has massive amounts of debt within the country. It's a bit like actually Ireland and Spain 15 years ago. Before the financial crisis, Ireland had about, I think, 40 or 50% debt to GDP. And all the debt and all the risk was in the banks and the property sector. And when the government bailout happened, the government took a lot of those liabilities onto the government balance sheet. And that's really the risk, I think, for China, is that we'll have to kind of nationalize a lot of the liabilities if there's a crisis there. Or it could go the way of Japan. On the chart, I've put Chinese and Japanese yields for the last 10, 15 years. The Chinese economy could have a kind of a lost decade. And either way, it will have to resolve its debt. And China will be kind of the marginal buyer in the world economy for, hard commodities. So that's something I think to watch extremely carefully. And I think what the Chinese are trying to do at the moment is have periodic injections of liquidity into the system to kind of allow people to deleverage. So they are trying to kind of, soft land the economic plane, as it were. But this plays into the whole debate about debt and how individual countries try and reduce their debt load without upsetting the momentum of their economy. But I think for steel and demand for machinery, China now, given everything that's happened with tariffs, is probably the marginal source of movement of prices and activity. Into all this, everywhere I go, I always get questions now on gold. I never got them 2 years ago. And the fact that gold is rising suggests that there's kind of angst or worry about the state of the financial system. Because if you did a kind of a fundamental valuation of gold, it should be about 2,500, it's 4,000. So that extra $1,500 is a kind of a worry premium about kind of the end of globalization, the rise of geopolitics. It's a kind of a hedge. And that reflects into the debate on the dollar, and the dollar is key for you guys. And there's a whole cottage industry of people out there saying, well, the dollar is going to collapse. And there are some very interesting studies that have looked at kind of empires going back to Rome and Greece. And whenever a country ceases to be an empire, its currency begins to weaken. A great example is the British pound. So during the American Civil War, which is the spike there, one British pound would have bought you $10. But since then, America obviously has grown. We had Bretton Woods, which was effectively the handover of economic power from Britain to America. And the pound has tended to weaken. And I'm not in the camp that says that the dollar is going to kind of structurally weaken. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, there's no obvious outright competitor. Okay? So one of my favorite economists is a guy called Charles Kindleberger. So if you're fascinated by, market bubbles and crashes, he's written the best book on this. He wrote it in the 70s, but it's still relevant. It's called Crashes, Manias, and Bubbles. And he was also the guy who wrote the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. And in 1970 said, well, the dollar looks weak, but it's probably here to stay because there's no alternative. And 50 years later, the same is true. So the obvious successor to the dollar is the euro. The European economy is not yet big enough, and our capital markets are not big enough to get the euro from, say, 25% of all FX trading up to sort of 35%. And then you've got smaller currencies, the yen, the pound, the Swiss franc, etc. The renminbi is tiny compared to Chinese GDP. And generally, Chinese financial markets are not liquid enough. Its monetary policy is not transparent enough. It doesn't have the corporate governance that international investors like. So I don't see the renminbi being a serious competitor to the dollar in the next 10, 15 years at all. The other thing to bear in mind is that all of the financial wiring or plumbing of the world is American. So all the big payment companies, all the investment banks, all the big private equity companies, they're all American. It's actually one of the few industries where the US just kind of owns the wiring, as it were. And until that changes and until competitors come along there, the dollar is not going to go away. So I think the dollar is here to stay. In some respects, however, we're kind of starting from the wrong place because we started this year with the dollar or the dollar index at one of its highest levels ever. And the dollar is just coming to the end of kind of a 10-year bull run. And currencies tend to move in these big waves. They're never at fair value. They're always kind of coming down past their fair value, then they overshoot it, and then they go back up in these big, long cycles. So I think we've started into a kind of a dollar weakness cycle. And if you are a planner in an industrial firm, you'd be prudent to say that the dollar can weaken by sort of 3% per year for the next 5 or 10 years. And that's not including shocks like, the Fed losing its independence or financial crisis in other countries like China. So my simple kind of forecast is that the dollar is actually starting from a very expensive level, and I think it's going to adjust lower and become more competitive over the next 5 or 7 years. And I think that's a fair assessment. The other thing I think that, just before I summarize this section, the other thing I think that's interesting is the idea of the business cycle. And I put this in because your sector is very cyclical, okay? And if you go right back in time, even back to the 19th century, you look at business cycles, it's a bit like the cardiograph of the world economy. A business cycle on average lasted 4 or 5 years. And the oddity of globalization is that instead of having these kind of choppy business cycles, we've had, a couple of periods of just super long expansion. Okay, you can see it on the chart, the way, in the last maybe 30 years, we've had these periods of, and the chart shows the unemployment rate. So when that's coming down, that means the economy is growing. Super long periods of expansion punctuated by crisis as these kind of imbalances blow up. And I think into the future, the business cycles will go back to being a bit shorter and more staccatoed. And that's actually really meaningful if you are in an industrial company, if you're in a chemical company, and you're trying to forecast, you're trying to plan inventory, trying to plan financing. Assuming like a 10-year business cycle is probably the wrong thing to do. I think we're going, and it's definitely a point for debate. The other issue, I think, is that we've come off a period where, because of COVID and other emergencies, economic policymaking is just all over the place. Okay? So what I mean by that is that governments are acting as if there's an emergency. So in an economic emergency, governments would spend a lot. And we've just had a budget in Ireland, and the government is spending like crazy. They're spending rather than investing. In the US and the UK and France, budget deficits are very big, 5-6% to GDP, and you would expect them to be much smaller at this stage in the business cycle as governments kind of save up for a rainy day, and they're not doing that. So economic policy making is, I think, quite muddled. Economies are not well synchronized. So in a normal business cycle, the US, Europe, and China are all kind of recovering together. China is dealing with deflation. The US has inflation. Europe is beginning to recover after kind of a difficult 2-year period. So that makes it very, I'm not excusing economists, but it makes it very difficult to give a kind of a straight outlook as to say, well, GDP is on the rise and wages are growing, etc. And And also I think the other imprint, which is interesting, which I'll touch on in a minute, is AI spending. So if we didn't have the AI sector in the States in the last year, GDP growth would be flat. And instead it's very, very strong. So there's all these kind of new things that are imprinting on the economy. You've got big moves in terms of the labor market as well. So the outlook is actually quite noisy. And going back to April, quite uncertain, even though some of that uncertainty is beginning to abate. So, just to sum up that section with implications for your sector, one of the new things we're seeing is unorthodox policymaking. So orthodox policymaking is kind of, if you called in the IMF and they would say, well, you've got all these deficits, you have to start cutting spending, raising taxes. And in some countries like Argentina, we have policies kind of very much from the left field. And it's not yet clear as to whether they will work or not. In countries like the UK, who are doing things according to the textbook, they are not working yet either. Something to bear in mind, I think, for the future is that debt means that in the future, cash-rich companies and cash-rich states will be the winners, and companies that have got weak balance sheets will be the losers. So if your counterpart is an indebted company, or if you are doing trade financing with someone and their credit rating is not great, that's something you will have to bear more in mind, I think, in the next 5 or so years. So the concept of balance sheet strength is going to be a much bigger differentiator. In terms of outright demand, for me, where we are with the US and Europe kind of in mild recoveries, the wild card is what happens to China. And if China has a recession or some kind of crisis, that will have a negative demand effect. It'll also help to bring down inflation and bring down interest rates. But for me, that's kind of that's the wild card. And then energy, which is really important in Europe. Many European countries, so Germany is the prime example, have absolutely screwed up their energy policy. And they're now beginning to reverse that. And debates that were somehow sacrosanct 5 or 10 years ago on nuclear power, etc., green power, are being reversed. So I actually think that on a 5-year basis, energy prices will probably fall in Europe. We'll go back to having a better mix of energy across Europe. On the dollar, I'm not in the camp that the dollar is going to evaporate. On a fundamental view, I think it will sort of, on average, edge lower from a very, very high level over the course of the next 5 to 7 years. And then finally, if you're kind of the economic planning variety, expect business cycles to be shorter and to kind of go back to the average over time. And then, the last thing I want to talk about is technology and AI, and it's the adaptation of AI. I notice anecdotally is picking up rapidly. When ChatGPT came out, I started emailing friends and family saying, have you heard about this? And I asked ChatGPT to write in the same way as I would write, and it failed completely. But now it can do that, which is quite scary. And I have friends who use voice-driven AI, and the voice-driven AI can mimic their accent. So it's getting into kind of quite intimate places in some respects. And I think in terms of the stage of AI, I think we're now getting into a number of interesting quarters. So one is, I think data will become much more important, specialized data. So we're moving away from kind of the large language models being trained on kind of the broad internet, if you want to put it that way. And we are seeing more specialized deployment of AI in pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, to help build new drugs. Sanofi, for example, reckons it can cut the drug development cycle from 13 to about sort of 5 years using an AI company called Auken. It's being deployed by the military. The best example I can find for how to best use AI is an old British program called One Man and His Dog. And some of you may have heard about it. It was a very kind of quirky sheepdog trial where you had a farmer and his sheepdog, and they would be taken into a field in Yorkshire, and there's a flock of sheep, and said, right, herd the sheep into the next field. And I would regard the sheepdog as a kind of a non-human, intelligent actor who could help the human with a complex task. That sounds a bit clunky, but that's what AI does. So the ideal use of AI is if you are a professional, you're a specialist, you're experienced, and you use the AI to help you solve a problem that would otherwise you couldn't solve or might take a long time, and it makes you better off. So surgeons, for example, or doctors. So for me, that's the idealized way to use AI. I think politically, we're on the cusp of a realization in the States, Europe, and other parts of the world that AI is going to impact labor markets. I was talking to KPMG yesterday, which is a big accounting firm, and they were saying that they have cut quite dramatically the number of graduates that they will hire because of AI. But even they're beginning to kind of rethink that at the moment. So, and that would become a political, social issue if lots of young people can't get professional jobs, and you may get a political backlash against it. The economic impact of AI is really, certainly in the States, and you can see this also in Europe, is really quite dramatic. So if I compare it to, say, hard residential or office building in the States, because of the after effect of COVID, is coming down, but data centers are shooting up. And the use of electric power is also shooting up. And that in itself is beginning to push up inflation. And in Ireland, 22% of our electricity in this country already goes to power data centers. So we're kind of slightly ahead of the trend there. And lots of Irish engineers are now going to the States, other parts of the world, to help build some of those data centers. So the imprint of AI and the demand for energy, demand for raw materials is very, very strong. And I suspect that this, we can debate whether it's a bubble or not. I think it's beginning to become kind of bubbly. But I suspect that this kind of trend will continue for the next 3 or 4 years. And will have multiple implications for industry. So many of the companies in your sector use it for quality control. BMW, Hyundai use it in safety checks. Airbus Ventures tell me that they use it in terms of measuring energy efficiency. The private equity industry, which I know reasonably well, use it in terms of due diligence. Someone told me a kind of a private story where they were about to sign a funding deal for a company, and they ran AI on the founder and found out something about him that they didn't like, and the deal collapsed, right? So it's quite invasive, and it's having impacts on investment decisions. It will change the labor market. So I think robotics and AI will actually open up many sectors to female workers, to older workers, which I think is actually very encouraging given demographic changes, and also supply chains. I've mentioned some of the companies like Altana, for example, will become much more robotized and much more driven by AI. DHL, GXO, and Agility, the logistics firm, already beginning to use it. So this is really transformative. One of the things, people ask me, well, what do you advise we do to try and keep an eye on this? And for bigger firms, I advise that they set up corporate venture units, because bigger firms are often too big to properly innovate and change, but by having a little kind of investment unit that focuses on their ecosystem and investing in some of the new companies, you get to really feel the innovations that are coming through and their relevance for your company. And I know that's not relevant to sort of smaller and medium-sized companies. It's maybe something you can do collectively, but for me, it's quite a tangible way of keeping an eye on some of the new developments. So I'm going to stop there and maybe take questions. So I think that the message I would leave you with is that, the last 30, 35 years was a period of prosperity, bounty, calm. We're leaving that. Bits of it are being hacked away. And then in other parts, bits of the new world order are being constructed. And this is kind of it's a construction site. It's a bit like the Big Dig. It's going to take 15, I think the Big Dig took more than 15 years, right? It'd take 15 years to settle down. There'll be lots of policy experiments. The really big picture stuff is the implications of debt for economies and for politics, shorter supply chains, geopolitics, so a world where countries are more selfish and maybe and they're more strategic and probably less trusting, and that has implications for supply chains, and then the implications of new technologies for business and health and humanity. So thank you, and I'm happy to open up to questions now.
So if you have any questions, thank you, Max. Any questions you might have, just pop your hand up. I'll come around with the microphone and you can position your question. Right over here.
Yeah, can you tell me who is paying for the American tariffs?
It depends. I mean, but it is very close to the end consumer. So in some sectors, companies are absorbing some or all of the tariffs. In mostly commodity-led sectors, it's the consumer. Yeah, and I'd just say, I mean, tariffs in the economic orthodoxy, you wouldn't be putting tariffs on steel because steel is a kind of a commodity. The orthodoxy would say is that if you have a section of your economy that's kind of struggling, Germany 10, 15 years ago as an example, you put tariffs on, we call it opposing companies, to give your companies, that industrial sector the time to remake itself and to become competitive. And that was amongst nations, that was the understood deployment of tariffs. What we have today is quite different. And Switzerland is a great example because Switzerland is and it still has a 39% tariff on goods coming into the States. And Switzerland produces high-end industrial mechanical goods that are not produced in the States. So there's no, in many respects, so there are not many competitors, and they produce chocolate, which is, in the same way, not produced at the same level in the States. So there is a kind of illogic to it, which leads me again to the conclusion that the White House is just trying to kind of raise revenue from other countries as opposed to be more strategic.
With the globalization in the last 35 years, we saw a lot of continued growth. I think a lot of that was due to the growth in demand from those developing countries.
Yeah.
Where do you see demand coming from in the next coming years? Growth and demand.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So I think in general the world has to get over the hump of debt for there to be a really strong demand-led recovery. Now, as I've said, many countries' households are quite strong. The part of the world that interests me a lot is what people misleadingly call the global south. So that would be big populous countries, Nigeria, Indonesia, etc. And they have potential demand. How they kind of realize that demand, I think, is still an open question. And I would say in many of those countries, governments are quite puzzled as to what. First, they're puzzled on at least two fronts. What economic model they should follow. Should they follow kind of the European model, democracy-led societies, open economy? Should they have a kind of more of a planned, state-driven Chinese approach? So many of them are still dealing with that. many of them are building their economic infrastructure. And the other thing they are grappling with is how to collaborate, because together they are quite big, but they're very, very different. So on a structural basis, I think it would be the emerging world. And if I had to pinpoint one zone, I think it would be this idea of the fourth pole, of an economic cooperation zone centered around Abu Dhabi, reaching far into India, Saudi, and the greater area. And the one thing I pick up in all these countries is that they are fed up of being told what to do by Europeans, Americans, in older economies. And that's quite a new thing. I mean, maybe they're always fed up, but now they're saying it. So I think this region has got the makings of a kind of an independent and coherent zone of demand.
You believe likely in January there would be some progress, some resolution between U.S. and China. So we're now into month, say, 5 or 6 of this tariff conflict. So why will it take another 4 to 5 months until there's some progress?
I think there's a few factors. So there is a back channel process. I think there's also both countries still have to feel kind of slightly more marginal pain from the kind of the deadlock that they're facing. And I also think that if and when they strike a deal, it won't be a deal proper, it'll be kind of a ceasefire, right? Such that many of the more punitive measures that were said to have been imposed in China won't be imposed. And China will be less restrictive in things like rare earth. There'll be a degree of calm. The wild card, I think, is what happens in terms of signaling over Taiwan. If there's any even subtle signaling over Taiwan, I think that's one of the big sticking points. But I don't think it'll be a kind of a final agreement between the US and China on trade. It'll be kind of let's have a ceasefire for a couple of years, effectively.
I actually have a question myself. What is your take on the BRICS conglomerate, and what potential threat do you see that impacting global trade as it is right now?
So the BRICS are very disparate, very diverse. And I would say that the idea of BRICS is being, to give you another acronym, is being replaced by the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a slightly more menacing version of the BRICS. So that was in force maybe 20 years ago as kind of a club encompassing Russia, China, Pakistan. India was always a formal member, but never an active member because Pakistan was a member. And then Iran is kind of a guest member. And this grouping of countries, I mean, you can see it as kind of an Eastern rival to NATO, or to AUKUS, for example. And in a somewhat nefarious way, they are, China is increasingly obviously aiding Russia in Ukraine, to the extent that it's become a very, very big diplomatic issue now with Europe. And the European-China dialogue is conditioned by Chinese financial and military aid to Russia. So I think BRICS has become it's becoming less of an economic zone, more of a kind of a geopolitical zone. And also I think the BRICS countries, their growth path is increasingly less of a straight line. And many of them are having their own economic troubles. India is probably the strongest one at the moment.
Do you have any thoughts on how individual territories' policies on carbon emissions are impacting their businesses' trajectory for growth?
I can speak a bit to Europe. And I think it is something where you would probably see an awful lot more flexibility in terms of European individual government policy. I mentioned Germany, which was it was the country with the biggest Green Party, the country that led green policy. So I think a lot of those restrictions are being softened and probably be softened in their implementation in the next maybe 5 or 10 years.
Hello, thank you so much for your speech. And my question is, you mentioned that so far the tariffs on the US, they have been absorbed by the customer, by the end customers or the clients. Considering these new tariffs, where would you put the limit of these customers to really keep absorbing these increasements and to try to find the breakout point, or to the limit, the absolute limit where they say, we don't want to absorb it anymore?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we are now, this is why I think the two keys to tariffs are China and inflation. And inflation, I mean, inflation in Europe has come right down and stayed down. In the US, we've had a dip in inflation. It looks like it's beginning to go back up, driven by a whole range of factors: electricity prices, consumer goods prices, the labor market is tightening. So I think a generalized upsurge in inflation in the States will be to my reading, would be the limit of the tariff policy, because I think tariffs are clearly one of the motivating forces. I can't, without knowing kind of the P&L of individual sectors, it's hard to say where the kind of the pain threshold for certain sectors is. But I think a generalized rise in inflation, coupled with a rise in kind of interest rate expectations, if the White House and the Treasury Secretary are listening at all, is a sign that they just have to back off. And I think we're kind of getting there very quickly.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Great speech. Thank you.
Thank you.